This is Katharine Hayhoe, Dr. Katharine Hayhoe. I've known her for quite a while. We actually wrote something together a long time ago.
Yeah.
She is a physicist who has trained as an atmospheric scientist. And I'm just going to read a little here about her history so you just get an idea that she's got these incredible chops in multiple areas. So she is an accomplished atmospheric scientist. For those of you in the room who count things like this, more than 20,000 citations of her work. But she's also, as I said, a really gifted communicator. And she's really, I would say, are you world famous? Or you're certainly famous in the United States of America and Canada. She's Canadian. And she's won the AGU Stephen Schneider, and anyone who knows Steve Schneider, that's an incredible honor. Communication Award. He was a phenomenal communicator. And she has picked up the torch and is now the phenom. She's also won the United Nations Champion of the Earth Award. She's been on a whole bunch of lists, but some of these are pretty wild. Time Magazine's 100 Most Influential People, Foreign Policies, 100 Leading Thinkers, Fortune Magazine's World's Greatest Thinkers. That's incredible. If I'd known that, I would have written more papers with you.
Is it too late?
No, we can still write a paper
Okay.
about what we were talking about in my
let's
office.
do it. Yeah.
She has a TED Talk that has 4 million views. Check it out. I won't tell you the title, but it's close to what we'll be talking about today. And she just published a book, Saving Us, a climate scientist's case for hope and healing in a divided world. And at the event, we were in Detroit earlier today, and her book sold out. And I was just very popular, but you'll see why. She's a professor at Texas Tech, not just a professor, she's a distinguished professor, and also an endowed, she has an endowed professorship in public policy and public law. Wow. A physicist, atmospheric scientist. I love interdisciplinary. And as I said, she's Canadian. She got her undergrad degree from University of Toronto, and her MS and PhD from atmospheric sciences at the University of Illinois. So she's a Big Ten product. And most recently, and I don't know how she does all this stuff and still finds time to go skiing and break her wrist, but she's chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy. And those of you who've known the Nature Conservancy for a long time, that's huge, because again, I think it's so important to communicate. So thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure. We first, I think, worked together on the National Climate Assessment. And that was where I had the opportunity to do work that directly related to how climate change was affecting people. And that process has continued. It's just gotten better and better, I think, over the years. And it shows us how important this issue is and how it relates to all of us, no matter where we live.
Yeah. And of course, that report that just came out this week from the IPCC is really striking, because it kind of gives us a sense that we're close to being exceeding the hard limits of some of our adaptation capability. Close, not quite there yet.
Right.
But I really want to focus today in our discussion. Well, I'll ask some questions and we'll just discuss, and then we'll open up the floor. And who's keeping time? Can you keep time? And just tell me when we should start opening it up to questions from the floor. I want to make sure everyone can ask. But I think, we've been around a long time in climate science.
Yes.
And I have a funny feeling one thing that motivates us both greatly is that we're running out of time. We really need to get action, and we need to be acting faster.
Yeah.
And so I'd like to focus on that. And I think this morning you talked about, you were very compelling, what your bottom line was. And why don't you start off by saying a few words of what we really need to do, all of us need to do. To do our part to speed things up.
Yeah. So what we need, these chairs are really comfy.
They are incredibly
It's sort of hard to sit formally in them. It's really clear what we collectively need to do, right? We need to stop putting carbon into the atmosphere, we need to take it out of the atmosphere, and we need to learn how to adapt to the changes that are already occurring. Those are the 3 things we have to do. But then we start thinking, well, what do I need to do as an individual? And there is a huge and endless debate these days in the Q&A after a talk or on Twitter, where there's a lot of climate scientists there and a lot of people who are really concerned about climate change, and they're always asking, is it about individual action or system-wide change? And my answer to that is yes. Because how do you change a system without individuals taking action? The only way a system has ever changed is when individuals were the catalyst for the change. But here's where it gets really interesting and really nuanced. So then people say, okay, so you're talking about changing your light bulbs, biking to work or campus or school, plant-based diet, you're talking about carbon footprint solutions. I'm not. Now don't get me wrong, I do those solutions myself. But the reason I do them is because of the impact it has on me and those around me. And I know that the most effective thing I can do is not a personal carbon footprint choice, but rather engaging my climate shadow, as it's been called. The way that our words and actions and attitudes have this ripple effect on people around us. Every single one of us has a voice, and by using our voice, that's the most powerful weapon that we have, and that is what has changed the world before. If we look at the major societal shifts that have happened over the last 200 years, if you look at how slavery was abolished in England, how women got the vote, how civil rights were enacted, how apartheid ended, none of those happened because the leader of a country or a very influential person just sort of woke up one day and decided it had to change. Every single one of those things happened because individuals who at that time were not well known at all, and even still we only know a fraction of their names today, individuals decided the world had to be different, and they used their voice to advocate for change. And for every 2 steps they took forward, they were pushed back a step. It didn't take months, it didn't take years, it took them decades. But they changed the world. And that's the way we can do it again. And like you said, we've already been doing this for decades. So it's time. It's time to get there. And how we're going to get there is, I think, when everybody uses their voice, wherever they are.
So you use your voice with who?
Everybody you know. So people might say, okay, well, everybody I know thinks the same way I do. But if you look at the data, people aren't talking about this. So how do you know people think the same way as you do if you're not talking about it? And even if they care about it, the data shows that they're not activated. Did you know that 70% of us are worried about climate change in the US? 83% of young people are worried about climate change. Do you know what percentage are activated? 8%. 8% are activated. How do we activate each other? By talking about not only why it matters, but what we can do about it, because the reason we're not activated is we don't know what to do. So how do we find out what to do? By sharing. Here's what another university is doing. Why doesn't our university do it? Here's what some friends of mine are doing in their house. Why don't we do it here too? Here's what another business is doing. Why doesn't our business do this too? Here's what our outdoor rec club is doing. Here's what our group of friends who go kayaking together are doing. Here's what our ultimate frisbee team is doing. Here's what the Rotary Club is doing. Every one of us is part of something greater than ourselves, and that's where we can use our voice, engage our climate shadow, and kick in that ripple effect.
Yeah, and then also probably something political.
Oh yeah, we're all part of something where we can vote. And
Yeah.
that is a huge way to use our voice. But not just at the federal level. So often, because most of the news nowadays just relates to the federal, at the federal level, we forget that 99.5% of elected officials are not federal. And that means that it's a lot easier to have conversations with them. And it also often means it's a lot easier for them to change. Cities can change a lot more quickly than a state. A state can change more quickly than a country. And we need those changes at every level.
But there is a connection politically. And I guess the holy grail, what I spend a lot of time worrying about is just how do we make climate change a bipartisan issue? Because there is one party in America that seems dead set in their support of fossil fuels. And we all know the fossil fuels can't really exist in a clean climate world. And so,
At least burning them, we can't be burning them.
can't burning them.
Yeah.
Yeah, can't burn them. We'll still be using them for plastics, we'll still be using them, obviously. So how do we create this sort of bipartisan, how do we cleave politics away from climate change, I guess? Is there?
That's the $1 trillion question, I think. And I don't think there's any one answer to it, but I think there are multiple answers. So, first of all, climate change is the most politicized issue in the United States, and has been that way for over a decade. And so we often make the mistake of saying, well, they don't have the facts. So they need more facts. Maybe we can make animated temperature graphs. Maybe we can, we can be, make more educational videos. Maybe we can do a better job of the science. But it isn't the science. Because back in the 1990s, Democrats and Republicans had the same opinions about climate change. Science denial is only about 20 years old. And how old is climate science? 150 years old or more. So we make the mistake of thinking that they just don't know the science. That's not what's feeding the objections. What's feeding the objections is solution aversion. People don't think there's anything we can do to fix it. So what's the solution? The solution is solutions that are compatible and consistent with their values. How do we do that? Well, first of all, there is a bipartisan climate solutions caucus in Congress and the Senate, where they only allow a Democrat to join if they join with a member of the other party. So that's a specific ask that people can make if they live in a red district or a red state, to say, would you be willing to join this bipartisan climate solutions caucus? They got solutions right there in the title. Then we did a really interesting experiment a year and a half ago, where working with researchers at Yale who do those, the 6 Americas of global warming and the public opinion maps, we created 4 short videos that framed climate change around a value that was near and dear to many Republican hearts. So one was by a former Republican congressman who talked about free market solutions to climate change, Bob Inglis. One was by a libertarian who talked about personal liberties and climate change. One was by a retired Army general who talked about national security and climate change. And then I did one both as a scientist and as a person of faith talking about Christian values and climate change. So the Yale researchers did something brilliant. They picked 3 purple districts, so 50-50 Republicans, Democrats, and they paid not very much money to boost these videos on YouTube and Facebook and social media, using social media for good. And they were super short videos, 1 minute each. You can find them online if you go to newclimatevoices.org. You can actually watch the videos yourself. They boosted them on social media in these purple districts, and they tracked public opinion on climate change in the districts. And what they found after several weeks of persistently airing these videos on social media, they found that Democrat opinions on climate change went up a bit. They found that Republican opinions on climate change went up twice as much on every metric they measured. Why? Because it was being framed around something they cared about. Personal liberties or the free market or national security or Christianity. So that's another clue of how we can defuse this, is by starting the conversation with something that they already care about and then connecting the dots. Because as humans, we tend to think everybody should care for the same self-evident reasons that I do. Not only is this issue important, but you should care about it because of this reason. But it doesn't really matter, does it? I mean, one person could care about it because they are a passionate winter athlete and a skier. Somebody else would never, ever want to even touch snow. They care about it because they're a parent and their child can't breathe because of all the wildfire smoke in the air. Somebody else might care about it because they're a veteran and they know the Department of Defense says this is a threat multiplier. It doesn't matter why they care. What matters is that they do care. So if we could figure out what makes people tick and then connect the dots to why climate change matters to them and show them, we could show them that they're the perfect person to care.
This is wild that I've never heard about this video effort.
Really?
Yeah.
It was published in Nature.
I'm a dean. Who has time to read anything?
Oh no, I wasn't judging you. I was just saying it's legit.
No, I'm sure
Yeah,
it is.
yeah.
It sounds very familiar. And it's interesting because we have a very strong Institute for Social Research here.
Mm-hmm.
And they do a lot of the polls that you hear about, when you're listening to NPR on the way in to work. And the new director is very interested in figuring out what these things are. But I hadn't thought about the video idea. That's marvelous. Yeah.
And it didn't really cost too much at all.
Yeah.
But for some reason, when you talk to all of the funders of climate research and climate engagement, whether it's the federal government or whether it's foundations, for some reason, they don't understand the value of communication. And they're not interested in investing in that. It's more kind of the brute force approach.
It's really surprising if it's a proven tool. Because that's the thing, is so many things we try aren't proven or just don't work. I mean, so many scientists are happy to go out and just tell people the way it should be.
Exactly.
And that's not what you want to do.
And I'm sorry to say this, but the anti-science movement, they know exactly how to use social media. So one of my colleagues, Ashley Landrum at Texas Tech University, she is in media and communication, and she and her grad students study the flat earth theory, conspiracy theory. And what they found is that YouTube is primarily responsible for the spread of flat earthism. YouTube. Without YouTube, it would be a guy living in his mom's basement, literally. But because of YouTube, you've got NBA basketball players. And then look at all of the conspiracy theories with COVID. How did they spread? On social media. And so social media is a tool. You can use it for good or you can use it for evil. And why give that tool up entirely and relinquish it when we could use it too?
Okay, we're going to start working on this.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll work on it together.
All right.
So we're both at universities. You're down in Texas, and we're up here in Michigan. We both have our share in our states of folks who are a little unexcited about climate change action. And one thing that both our universities have in common too is they're public universities with a lot of students.
Yes.
What should universities across the nation be doing to get the word out more or to change behaviors? Let's skip the word getting the word out. We're really interested in changing behaviors, making this bipartisan.
To change behavior, I think we need two things. We have to understand how this relates to us here and now. If somebody is majoring in art, if somebody's majoring in pharmacy, if they're majoring in business, if they're majoring in law or architecture or engineering, we have to understand how it affects us, our career, our interests, our lives. That's the first half of the point. It isn't only about the polar bears, it isn't only about Antarctica, it's about what is happening right here and right now, and it's about my future. But if we understand the risk, but we don't know what to do about it, nothing's going to happen. So that's why the other half that has to be communicated at the same time is, what can each of us do to contribute? If I'm going into business, what are businesses already doing, what more needs to be done, and how could I help? If I'm going into journalism, what is journalism and reporting already doing, but what do they need to do more, and how could I help? If I'm going into architecture, if I'm going into law, now there's a burgeoning field. I'm very fascinated by the increase in our ability to attribute extreme events and even the financial damages of extreme events to climate change. That's going to be a whole new field of law pretty soon, I think. But in every field that we're going into, thinking, how is this already being affected? What solutions are already being implemented? And what can we do more? So for example, the University of Colorado, it's not uncommon to be talking about climate change in public health programs, but the University of Colorado has the first medical climate change program where they actually have like clinicians, like ER doctors and pediatricians learning about and doing climate change internships so they can see how it affects their patients. I mean, that is incredibly innovative, right? We need that at every level, and because climate change is not only an environmental issue, it is not just something you should be learning about in geography or something you should be learning about in environmental science or atmospheric science or earth sciences. Climate change is affecting every aspect of our lives. So if you're in the business school, you need to understand, and UM is very good at that. But if you're in the engineering, you need to understand. If you're in the medical, if you're in arts and sciences, if you're in humanities, you need to understand how climate change is affecting you and what your discipline can do to contribute to that. And what better place to do that at a university in the first year where students come in?
But it sounds almost like you'd want to require that all students get this perspective in this training, not in a class, or maybe in something shorter than a class.
Yeah, it could be a full class, or it could be a module. It could be that every entry-level class for that discipline has a module in it. Why would I want to require it? Because what's at stake is the future of human civilization as we know it. That's what's at stake. What is at stake is literally, will we have an effective educational system in the future? Because when society breaks down, what goes? What's the first thing to go? Education goes, public health goes, infrastructure and transportation, running water, the ability to move around, electricity. All of those things are suddenly off the table once we don't have the resources that we're used to, that we take for granted. And that's what climate change threatens, because we're living on a planet now that our civilization was never designed to cope with. And the further and faster we move beyond the nice Goldilocks conditions over which human civilization developed, the greater the risks of losing things that we take for granted today. We're fighting for our future, and what better place to fight for our future than at a university?
What do people think about that?
Yeah.
If all our students were on a beach down in Florida somewhere, I'd poll the audience and see if students are motivated by that. But who is a student in the room? Does this sound like a good idea? Should we be requiring this? Yeah. Anyone raise your hand? If not?
I see a lot of thumbs up and nods.
Yeah. There's a very old student over here. I'm not calling him old. Behind that mask is a very young man. Okay. So I've used up a half an hour. I have some more questions. But would anyone else like to ask Katharine a question? Andy.
Okay.
Hey.
Say who, at least where you hail from.
Andy Hoffman, Business School at CU. I want to hear more about your straddling academia and this new role with the Nature Conservancy. Does that make your job harder in either space? Is there synergy? Is your dean happy about it? Do you feel schizophrenic? What's it like splitting yourself in two in these two very different worlds?
Well, have you ever put your foot in a canoe and then started talking to somebody and then realized all of a sudden the canoe's 2 feet away from the dock? It feels a little bit like that. But I think it's really, I was actually, a year and a half ago, I had no idea I would be ending up here. I was just, I'm very focused on really trying to help people understand what solutions look like and how we can move forward quickly. But that's what I love most about TNC, is that they're so solution oriented and they have real practical actions that can be taken in the city of Detroit or up in the UP. And you can point to what those look like, and you can document the benefits today in terms of flood control, better air quality, providing a canopy for low-income neighborhoods that cools them down during heat waves. Oh, and it takes up carbon too. And those are exactly the type of solutions that people get so excited about. I also love how the Nature Conservancy has such a big tent approach. A lot of organizations are a little, they're very selective, like we only work with these type of people, or we only engage this sort of, but when we're talking about the future of human civilization and many living things on this planet, whose future does that not impact? And so really trying to,
But you're talking about one side of the equation. Do your academic colleagues think you've gone native? Can you actually publish that kind of work?
I definitely think I can. I haven't been there long enough to do that yet. I would say that the university was, they had never quite dealt with something like this before. They didn't know quite what to do, so they had to have all kinds of discussions. Are you allowed to voluntarily reduce your FTE? They had to take that to the Board of Regents to vote on. And I'm saying, you just pay me less money. And they're like, we have to think about that one. But they did agree, and they're very supportive about it. And I really love the way I'm still able to keep a foot in with students, with still doing some teaching, still keeping some of my research going, but being able to bring it out to the bigger stage and to encourage, at the Nature Conservancy, there's so many scientists that do have academic affiliations or that would be interested maybe in engaging more with students. And I think that's a great strength that the TNC could build with universities because they're able to offer that practical interaction and experience to students to show them what a difference you can make in the real world. And how could we not be inspired by that?
And just so it's clear, by the tone of my question, I
Oh.
really admire what you're doing.
No worries. No worries, Andy.
Yes?
Hi. So I have a little bit of a question. I'm speculating here about where you're coming from, but my guess is that you were trained and worked during a certain number of years as a scholar doing basic research, and you have 180 degrees change in your life right now because now you are communicating with other people, looking for solutions, something that we usually don't do when we do basic science. So how did you navigate that transition? How did you self-taught or prepare for this new world?
Well, the 180 actually began quite some time ago. So, in fact, honestly, it really began when, as an undergraduate student, so my undergraduate degree is in astrophysics. And I was already doing research, and I was planning to go to graduate school in that field. But I needed one extra class to finish my degree. I needed a breadth requirement. And I looked around, and this is an interesting connection. I looked around, and there was a brand new class that was being offered for the very first time at my university, University of Toronto, on climate change. And it was being taught by someone who had just finished doing a postdoc at NCAR with Steve Schneider. So Danny Harvey's the name of the guy, and he had just finished doing a postdoc with Steve Schneider, so he was on fire. So I did not know what I was walking into. So I walked into this class, and growing up in Canada, the sky is blue, the grass is green, and climate is changing due to human activities. That was sort of my perspective on it. But I thought of climate change, as so many people still do, as an environmental issue that environmentalists care about, environmentalists work on, and the rest of us wish them well. That's the way I thought about it. And I didn't consider myself an environmentalist, and honestly, I still don't. But when I took that class, I was completely shocked to find out, first of all, that climate modeling was the exact same physics I've been learning in both my physics and my astronomy classes. But I was even more shocked to learn how urgent it was and how it was not only an environmental issue, which it absolutely is, but climate change was a poverty issue. Climate change was a food and a water and a resource scarcity issue. Climate change was a socioeconomic and racial and gender inequity issue. Climate change was a human issue. It was affecting every single person on the planet, but it was affecting those who contributed least the most. And it was profoundly unfair. When I learned that, I thought, I need to do everything I can to help fix this problem. And it's so urgent, surely we'll fix it soon. I can go back to studying galaxies. And that was a while ago. So that was where I first started to sort of pivot. And when I went to graduate school, the reason I ended up at University of Illinois, and I'm actually going to University of Illinois next week for my former advisor's retirement symposium. And when I met him, Don Wubbles, I knew he was the perfect person to work with because he was very focused on policy-relevant research. He was all about doing research that would actually make a difference in terms of, first of all, ozone depletion initially, and then looking at non-CO2 greenhouse gases and how reducing those could buy us some time with carbon. So I'd already started to pivot to do policy-relevant research. And I wanted to do research that made a difference that people could actually use to make decisions today and tomorrow, not 50 years in the future. And then, after about a decade or so, we moved to Texas. And the reason we moved to Texas was because we were just looking for a spousal hire. And they wanted my husband, and they were willing to offer a +1 to get him. And the +1 was me. So they got stuck with a climate scientist, which they didn't really see coming in their search for a really good applied linguist. So there I was in Texas. And that was where I got my first invitation to speak to a non-choir, so to speak, group. Up to then, I had spoken to some public groups, but they were all people who were already worried, they were already concerned, they just wanted the latest update. But that was the first time when I was invited to speak, and I remember it was a League of Women Voters group, which is usually pretty, center to left, but this is West Texas. So they were willing to invite me, but they weren't necessarily sure about what I was going to say. And I realized that I had always thought, people who reject the science, there's no way to have a conversation. But we had such a great conversation. They had so many good questions. And I listened very carefully to the questions because the questions were showing me what I hadn't said that they wanted to know. And then there was a woman there who was part of a book club, so she invited me to come speak to the book club. So I revised my presentation, I went to the book club, I listened very carefully to the questions they asked, because again, that was what I hadn't said that they wanted to know. And then somebody at the book club was the program manager for senior citizens speaking group. So then they invited me there a couple of weeks later. And then somebody there was part of the, I forget what it was then, the women's club. And then somebody there was part of Second Baptist Church. So then next thing I knew, I was speaking there on a Wednesday night. And it just sort of snowballed from there, realizing that if people got answers to their questions, they were concerned about climate change. And once they were concerned about it, they wanted to know what to do. And so I realized I need to learn how to be a better communicator because there's got to be people out there who study this. So I still remember Ed Maybach, who's one of the leading researchers on climate communication in the United States at George Mason University. He remembers how I just cold called him out of the blue. And I said, I've looked up, I've read your papers, you're one of the leading researchers in communication. Can you please tell me everything I need to know? And that was about 12 years ago. And since then, I follow the social science very closely. I collaborate with and I work with a lot of those researchers. I took every advantage of every training program I could get with the Union of Concerned Scientists and the American Geophysical Union and AAAS and others. And every single presentation I still give, I think to myself at the end, what did people ask me that they wanted to know that I didn't tell them? And how could I do better next time? Because if this really is the defining issue of our age, how can we, as the physicians of the planet, so to speak, not tell every single person who's being affected by it why it matters and how they can contribute to the solution? So in that sense, the Nature Conservancy is kind of a natural extension of that. Got a bunch of questions.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'll give
Absolutely.
shorter answers from now on.
Then we'll go over on this side.
Okay.
Hi, Dr. Hayhoe. It's so great that you're here. My name is Natasha Dechi, Channel Planet Science PhD student here at the university. And I had the great opportunity of attending COP26 last November.
Mm-hmm.
And something that I noticed was the lack of opportunity for observers and youth climate activists to really speak up and about what climate issues are super important to them and also what climate action we want to see. And so something like a common theme that's been happening is just a huge burden on youth climate activists to sort of quote unquote save us
Yes.
and save the earth. And so I was hoping that you could provide more insight because you started the conversation talking about individual voice and action leading to system change. So I was hoping you could provide more insight in terms of, the burden that youth climate activists have on their shoulders and what can be done moving forward to be more, inclusive of everyone stepping up to make a change and not just putting that weight on a younger climate activist.
I completely agree with you. It is not fair at all. In terms of those who have done the least to contribute to the problem, yet are bearing the brunt of the impacts, I think the intergenerational inequity is massive. I was just doing an event last weekend with a 15-year-old from Indiana who, there's this group of high school students in Indiana who have started to write climate legislation for Indiana. And they have educated themselves on how to lobby their elected state officials and get Republican as well as Democrat support for the bills they're trying to put forward. And they are so articulate and they're so talented and they're so dedicated. Yet he said, as you did, he said, we shouldn't have to be doing this. And he's right, and you're right, you shouldn't. Yet this is the world we're in, and by using your voices, you are changing the world already. So I was at COP also, and I was able to chair a panel that was made up of youth activists from around the whole world. And what they shared was really amazing. So the United Arab Emirates shared that they have a mandatory youth advisory panel that any climate change decisions they make have to be passed through. Companies like IKEA and Nestle are developing youth advisory panels so that those voices are heard. It isn't that the youth have to do it, it's just that they are being heard by people who will do it. So it's starting to change. Of course it's not changing fast enough, it never does. But it's starting to change, and it's changing because of the passion and because of the dedication of the voices that have been raised. So please take heart and be encouraged by that, because we are in a different place today than we were 5 years ago, and a large part of that is because of people like you.
Yeah, and I think youth activists have really changed.
Yeah,
It's a tipping point,
yeah,
and it really is helping us move forward in a faster way.
yes.
Drew?
Yeah, hi, Drew Grunwald, I'm here at Seas. Thanks, Catherine. So my question is about communication, and in particular about trends and variability. So we've got CO2, we've got global temperatures, but obviously things get really complicated when we start looking at climate change impacts and how they propagate at regional scales.
Yes.
And I'm really interested in hearing more about the challenges you've faced and what you've learned about communicating climate change at these regional scales, where not everyone is seeing temperatures going up. Maybe they're seeing more variability. Here in the Great Lakes region, we're seeing ice cover go all over the place, we're seeing water levels go all over the place. What challenges have you seen, and what strategies have you found to sort of translate that connection between global and then regional scales of climate change impacts?
Well, that's an interesting question, because it marries both my actual research and my communication. I do high-resolution climate projections, being as granular as the level of an individual city and weather stations within the city. And so I work with, when I was full-time at the university, I would take every summer to do consulting with cities or with states or with organizations who wanted that information, water districts. And I valued those experiences so much because I felt like I learned more from them probably than they did from me. And the first key is to listen to them and ask them, what have you experienced? What have you seen changing? What are you concerned about? And even just sitting them down and have me tell them over the last 10 years, or having them tell me over the last 10 years, what has happened that stressed your system, that incurred financial costs, that led to a breakdown in your inability to provide services or your infrastructure. Have them tell you what they're worried about. And then sometimes with some of those things, all you can say is, we don't know. We don't know how those things are changing. I remember the city of Boulder was really worried about wild temperature swings that they've been experiencing. And we looked at the historical record, we looked at future projections, no statistically significant trend. But then with other things, you can say, oh, so you're really concerned about the heat wave that you had in 2012 in Washington, D.C. So we can look at the statistics, how long did it last, how intense was it, how many records did it break, what was the difference between Tmin and Tmax. You can characterize the meteorological characteristics of the heat wave, and you can look at how much more likely it's already become today, and then how much more likely it would become in the future depending on the choices we make. And you can show them the impact of the choices that we have. You can even, you can get, we did an experiment once with Iowa corn farmers. I think we presented at AGU, but we didn't end up publishing it, where we showed them, we used their crop yield model. We actually went to them and said, what do you use, what do you trust? And then we looked at, as the world warms by 1.5 or 2 or 3 degrees, what those crop yield distributions would look like. And of course what happened was they broadened, right? They shifted and they broadened. And because of the variability and because of the way they farm, by the time you get to 2 degrees, there was too much variability for them to cope with. It was actually the variability that would do them in. And so all of a sudden you have a bunch of Iowa corn farmers who have a position on the Paris Agreement, which is amazing. But the key is to start where they're at rather than to start where we're at, if that makes sense. And of course, to be totally honest about it, there's some things we just can't say anything about these days. But there's a lot that we can say. And with the Great Lakes, for example, we know that the lake ice season is decreasing. We know that our summer heat is becoming, and our heat waves are becoming stronger and more intense. We know that we've seen major ecological shifts in the area, and we know that there's been significant increase in heavy precipitation, especially in the spring. So we can say that these are the things that we do see are happening, and we know that they scale, many of those scale with global temperature. And so that's why we want to mitigate, but that's also why we have to adapt.
It's incredible now. I mean, if you go back to when we were doing our national assessment work long ago, these things hadn't all emerged nearly as
No.
dramatically as they have now.
Oh, yeah.
And so we were kind of having to use the models more, having to use the theory more, having to use common sense more, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's remarkable to me how much has sort of played out. Not everything, but it's actually started happening just as we suspected it would.
Yes.
I mean, it really emerged.
I can't really think of a projection that was off base in any direction other than underestimating the rate of change.
I could probably think of some.
We would
I
probably
won't
think of
get into
something,
that, But
yeah.
but a few.
Yeah.
A few. You know, out west, for example, there was a lot of debate about whether precipitation would go up or down.
Right.
You know, and it's starting to be pretty clear now.
Right.
Mother Nature it's not going to go up.
Well, yeah, but I mean, look at your early work on megadroughts.
Right.
I mean, you had the tree ring work on megadroughts, and what are we seeing today out west? So,
Amplification.
yeah.
Another question. I think someone back here had a question.
Oh, there was back there and then back over there.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Who's going first?
Oh,
Okay.
I just had a question about the sort of marketing of the company message to specific audiences with your videos. So is it more effective when that message comes from someone who's already seen it being in that person's camp, or having some sort of similarity to the person who was talking to all the women, so you're obviously a woman, Christian, so have you studied that side of it at all?
Yes. So, in a nutshell, the answer is usually yes. So that's part of why I'm part of a group called Science Moms, moms who are climate scientists, and we are speaking to other moms. That's why I think organizations like Protect Our Winters that are winter athletes are so powerful, because you've got a bunch of winter athletes speaking to other winter athletes. So in general, I think it's very powerful to have people in that community speaking to people in that community. And that's why each of us using our individual voice is so important, because each of us has unique connections to unique communities. But let me put a tiny caveat on that. And this is based on an experiment that we did in the classroom that really surprised me. I made a 35-minute video for some researchers who wanted to study whether how I presented myself affected how effective my video was. So they worked at a pretty conservative Christian college, and I made a video, and then we edited out whether or not I introduced myself as a Christian or not. And it turned out that it made no difference whatsoever, and they hypothesized that's because the professor who they trusted was using the materials. So that's kind of hopeful, because what that means is if you produce good materials that could be used in the classroom or that could be used in any educational context, because a lot of businesses are doing educational training too now, as long as it's presented by a trusted messenger, the material itself does not have to be prepared by a trusted messenger. It's trust by proxy.
Interesting.
Yeah, I was surprised by that result.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming today. I'm curious if you could speak to how you remain optimistic.
I can, because I practice it actively. Yes. If we just wait for hope to show up, it's not going to. I mean, just go to any news site and look at the top 30 headlines. Do you see any hopeful, encouraging, positive headlines? No, you don't. And not just today, and not just during the pandemic, even before the pandemic. Why? Unfortunately, because the old saying in journalism is, if it bleeds, it leads. Doom gets clicks. And so our for-profit news organizations primarily are centered around presenting the bad news that makes you anxious, frustrated, angry, concerned, worried. So where does our hope come from? It comes from recognizing that if we do something, we can make a difference. And where can we find that hope? By going out and looking for people who are doing something and making a difference. So, like I said, I actively practice it. I always am going out looking, and that's part of what I actually use social media for, believe it or not. I look for examples of people who are making a difference, and I share those whenever I can. because that's what gives me hope. I feel like if one man who would bike to work in Minneapolis can single-handedly get a biking traffic report on the local news station and getting all kinds of other people biking because of that, if he can do that, what else can we do? If a 9-year-old kid can have a YouTube channel where he interviews people about climate change, what could the rest of us do? If you can have a group of grannies for solar, what can the rest of us do? This is what gives me hope, is recognizing that the giant boulder of climate action is not sitting at the bottom of an impossibly steep cliff with only a few hands on it. Sir David Attenborough, Greta Thunberg, and a few others. And if I had my hand, it is not going to budge a single inch. That's the way we often think about it. But once we start looking around at what's happening, and once we start acting ourselves, hope is all around us. That giant boulder is up at the top of the hill, rolling down the hill in the right direction. I've got my hand on the boulder pushing, and I look around, and there's 20 people beside me here, and there's 30 people beside me here, and I look around the corner, there's another 100 people there, and all of a sudden hope is everywhere. And that is so important, is to realize that we're not alone, that action is already happening, and that when we act, that is where we find hope. So often we think, I'm not going to act until I feel hopeful. And this is something we do all the time. I'm not going to go to the gym until I feel like it. I'm not going to eat healthily until I feel like it. Well, psychologists have shown that that's the motivation trap. If you go and exercise or go and eat healthy or go do what you're supposed to do, then you feel good afterwards. So when we don't feel hopeful about climate change is the most important time to take action, because that's what gives us hope.
And this goes back to the idea that you were really emphasizing this morning, and now you've emphasized it here, that we have to talk more. Because we really need, we're not going fast enough. We have to get more people acting. And they have to realize this is where you get hope. We can solve this problem. There are other ways to get hope too. I mean, the price of the solutions
Oh yeah.
are going down, down, down.
Yes.
And they're being deployed globally.
Oh yeah.
So that's, as we all know, market-wise,
Mhm.
that'll keep the prices going down.
Mhm.
So in the end, it's economically advantageous to solve this problem.
Mhm.
And of course, look what's happening with the war and the blackmail that's going on over fossil fuel
Yes.
supplies. It's advantageous, but the problem is that alone is not fast enough.
No, but you're totally right. I mean, I find hope in news that 90% of new energy installed around the world in 2020 was clean energy. If that isn't hopeful, what is? I get hope when I look at what countries like Costa Rica are doing in Morocco. I get hope from even looking at what's happening in Texas, believe it or not.
Amazing amount of
Yes.
wind.
Wind, and they're
Solar.
building the biggest solar farm in the country just outside of Dallas. The Dallas airport was the first carbon neutral airport in North America. And as soon as I say that, I immediately get people saying, oh, so they decarbonized all the flights, did they? I'm like, look, it's the airport. It's not American Airlines, it's not Southwest, it's the airport. Can you not celebrate what the airport did before you criticize them for not doing something that's out of their control? It's still pretty hopeful. And did you know, here's actually a really interesting fact, that United Airlines uses more low-carbon biofuel than all the other airlines in the world put together? I just learned that statistic
Really?
recently. I had no idea. And when I was telling somebody that, and they're like, why don't they paint that on every single plane they have? And I thought they should be doing that. They need some communication help. So all of these are hopeful things that the world is changing, but if we just wait for that hope to show up at the door of our minds, it's not going to. We have to go out and find that hope. And when we do, it is all around us. And then, you know what we have to do? We have to share the hope, right?
Yeah, and think about it. We were talking about, the public opinion. And you guys should all, if you're not already doing it, look at the Yale Communication public opinion data, the maps. You can see it down to counties or congressional districts.
Uh-huh.
But one of the things that I found fascinating is that even though majority of Americans want action, they don't think that the next president or the current president should be an agent for that change. That's what we got to change.
Yes.
In other words, it can't just be about the economy and energy independence and, all these hot button topics that one party seems to want to have us focus on. We've got to make climate number one, because it is number one for the economy in the end. It
It's
is
an
number
everything
one for
issue.
so many.
Yeah. In fact, I would almost say, and this is, I agree with you, but I would almost say a bit different. We don't have to make it number one, we just have to make it every issue. So if you're worried about the economy, it's a climate issue. If you're worried about national security, it's a climate issue. If you're worried about health, it's a climate issue. Water, it's a climate issue. The only reason we care about climate change is because it affects every single other issue at the top of our priority list.
Mhm. But we got to turn that into something more, you know, the State of the Union. You don't have a whole State of the Union that doesn't mention climate change.
Oh, no, I know.
By the president who has pushed climate change more than any other president. Climate change action.
Yes.
Do we have any other questions? I would love to hear, you know, I'll give you, you know, you got a chance to make some money here.
Oh, really?
What's the most important thing that you communicate in your new book?
Oh.
Why should everyone here either read your book or get that as a present for their, who? The crazy uncle or?
No. With the crazy uncle, you just say, I love you, but let's talk about something different. That's literally what you can do with the
You
crazy
hit him over
uncle.
the head with the book?
You could do that. But I don't recommend abuse of
It's not a
relatives.
big epic.
Yes. The reason I wrote this book, Saving Us, is because for years, for 3 or 4 or 5 years, no matter where I was, no matter who I was speaking to, I could be at a Lions Club, I could be at UC Berkeley, I could be speaking to a church, I could be talking to a carpet company. No matter who I was speaking to, I was getting the same 2 questions. And those 2 questions were, what gives you hope? And how do I talk about this issue? The majority of us are worried. The vast majority of us are already worried. But only 8% of us are activated. So that's why I wrote the book. To bridge the gap between the 70 to the 8%. Because if all of us who are worried were activated, we would change the world. Why are we not activated? Because we don't know what to do. And so that is really what the book is about, is how each of us truly can make a difference that's unique. Every single one of us has the ability to do something that nobody else can do because of who we are. Because of our expertise, our particular talents, our particular interests, the people that we know, the organizations we're involved with. Every single one of us has a role to play. And we climate scientists are pretty trusted messengers. But the most trusted messengers are family, friends, colleagues, people you know.
Neighbors?
Neighbors, exactly. So how many people have here have seen that Netflix movie, Don't Look Up? Most. Yes. Really interesting movie, right? I mean, I felt like it was like a documentary, to be honest, at some point.
Pretty good. Yeah.
Yes. And if I had been able to have my wish, you know what I would have done? I would have said, okay, you get to the end of the movie, and then restart the movie halfway through, and script out a completely different ending where individual voices advocating for change completely altered the outcome. That's what I would have liked to see from that movie. Now, it's too late to actually do that. I think all the actors have moved on to other projects. But what they did do, what Netflix did do, is they said, we're going to partner with Count Us In, which is a great organization about encouraging people to engage in climate action. And we're going to create a website that shares the most effective things that individuals can do to make a difference. And so they asked a lot of us, a bunch of different researchers and academics and experts in this area to help out. And here's what they came up with. If you go to this website, Don't Look Up, Count Us In, you'll see the top 6 actions. And you know what? Not a single one of those top 6 actions are things that have to do with your personal carbon footprint. The first action is talk about it. The second is join a group. The third is to make your vote count, like you said. Make your money count. Where you bank, where your credit card's from. And then when you start thinking about retirement, where your retirement and your pension and your savings are invested. Push for climate headlines. What the darker blue map, the darkest blue map there is, do you ever talk about climate change? And then there's one slightly darker, which is, do you ever hear about it in the news? And then use your voice to advocate for changes at work or school. And then going down from there, they have eat more plants and travel smart and take the personal actions, but then circle right back to talk about it. That's how powerful change can be. But it's not going to change if we as individuals don't take that first step. And that first step is to have those conversations about why it matters and what we can do to fix it.
And share these resources.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how many people knew about that resource?
Yeah.
You know, this great stuff can be out there, but it doesn't have an impact unless people know about it.
No.
Okay, let's end on, we have two hands. Can we go, are we allowed to go a little over? She's really in charge. You in the back, and then we'll come over here.
I'm left on one. So I love what you said about that there are more local elected officials. And I have a question about, the message is one thing, the other main message that I was hearing is the scale at which we appointed. And I'll preface it with myself and colleagues who are looking at corporate facilities around the country, and actually find that the percentage of population that is climate a threat actually predicts reductions in major corporate facilities. And so that's something, and other things as well. And so my question following that is, in terms of crafting your message, should we also be looking, instead of federal, which is harder to access, should we also be thinking of this in a local scale mobilization? Should we look to locally to City Hall and also to local companies that are
Yes.
also engaging in climate action?
100%. Cities are much more agile and mobile in terms of their ability to implement change. And we live in an increasingly urbanized society, right? So cities can put in place all kinds of different actions that it would take the federal government a decade to do. Cities can do it in a year or two. One of the most hopeful documents that I've found, speaking of hope, is the City of Houston's Climate Action Plan. The City of Houston, fourth largest city in the country, home to most of the US-based oil and gas industry, right? Incredibly vulnerable to hurricanes, rising sea levels, and increasingly heavy rainstorms. They have a climate action plan that is just full of the most fantastic practical solutions that also address issues of socioeconomic inequality, racial justice, cleaning up their air, protecting people from flood risk, and reducing their emissions as well. Cities are incredibly powerful, and honestly, I feel like one of the limitations of the COP process, of the Paris Agreement process, is that it's only countries. So back in 2015, when the Paris Agreement was signed, the mayor of Paris actually hosted a city gathering in the city. And I honestly feel that, as good as the Paris Agreement was, there was a lot going on over there in the cities. And when I was at COP this year, what I was most encouraged by was the fact that there was almost every major corporation you could think of, including the oil and gas companies, of course, but all the other ones there too to talk about what they were doing. There was, almost every major university was there to talk about what they're doing and bringing their students to help their students see what they could do. There were, all the big NGOs were there, of course, the Nature Conservancy and Conservation International and all of the big ones too, but it was just a cross-section of humanity there. So the answer is a huge yes because of the ripple effect. All of the U.S. mayors are part of the U.S. Mayors Conference, right? And they all go together and meet together and talk about what they're doing. A company here is part of a sector, and they go to meetings with other companies in their sector and talk about what they're doing. So absolutely, for sure, having those discussions is so important. And here, just outside of Detroit, well, you've got the biggest car companies in the U.S. right here at your doorstep. And they're taking this issue seriously. But they could certainly use more people raising their voices and saying, hey, did you consider this? Or good job over here, now how about this? That really is how change happens. So thank you for that question.
And there's a good podcast, Political Climate,
Oh.
and there are lots of good podcasts out there.
Yes.
But a recent one had a woman who runs a political action group focused on climate at the local scale. And she highlighted that over 50% of the climate action that needs to be done occurs at the local scale.
Mm.
And of course, when you have a Republican president and everything stops at the federal level, it can keep going at the state levels.
Oh, yeah. And it did.
And it did.
It did.
And that's really important
Yes.
too. Got to keep this momentum going no matter what we do.
Mhm.
One last question. Thank you.
I don't know if I made last year, but, so, I'm gonna step a little bit aside and just say, my great-grandmother was a really incredible role model for me, and, she was a physicist and actually the first woman to graduate as a physicist at the University of Warsaw. And I got, the privilege of growing up and knowing her. I remember one time I talked to her about feminism, and she said, "Oh, I'm not a feminist." And there was a great story there, but earlier you said, "I'm not an environmentalist," and I thought, well, that's a funny thing to say in this school and in this big blue sign that says School for Environment and Sustainability. I'm curious if there's a story there. Why did you choose to say that? What is it that?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I love the story about your great-grandmother. What a privilege. It is amazing. So I said I don't consider myself, is what I said specifically.
But you are.
But I think I actually am.
Did you get the hint there? Yeah.
Yes. And the reason I didn't consider myself is because often there's, a certain, this is something that, environmentalists only care about these types of things. And climate change is just such an all-encompassing issue. So what I would do is I would say I am an environmentalist, and I am a foodist, and I am a waterist, and I am an infrastructurist, and I am a healthist, and I am a humanist in the broadest sense of the word. I would say that I am for every single one of those things, not to the exclusion of any of them. And I think most of us in this room would probably agree with that, right? Thank you. That's a really great question.
And that's a great note to end on, too.
Yes.
I want to just thank you very much for stopping by here. We've been trying to get Katharine to spend time with us for a long time. And we were willing to do it on Zoom. I know you do about 80% of your encounters on Zoom, even before the pandemic. And now, of course, we all understand how that does work. But there's nothing better than having Katharine Hayhoe in person. And just thank you very much for doing that. And I hope everything's really And I don't know who took pictures of us with our masks off, but don't show them to anybody.